So put our hands together for Kira. Thank you. Hi everyone, thank you so much for having me. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for actually coming out in this weather. Big round of applause for yourselves and for each other. Thank you so much. Cool. So some of you might know me, probably from LinkedIn, with one of the most exciting places. Some of you might not. So I'll give you a little bit of background story to myself. So I'm Kira Saman, commonly known as Kiro. Also, just a little bit of housekeeping. Feel free to take photos of any of the slides or anything that comes up. Don't be shy. Also, we might play a little sipping game if anyone has a little drink. So this will actually help me improve my speaking manner. Every time I say just take a little sip of your drink and I'll pick up on that. Cool, so it's a little bit about myself. At some point in my life, I was born. This is me, circa 1989. This is my mom, also circa 1989. I was born in Khartoum in Sudan, up near North Africa. But my family is originally from Egypt, a few generations ago. I came to Australia in 1997 from space. And when I was a young kid, I wanted to be a pilot. I was a hand model for 26 years. That's a joke. But I was a helper model for 6 minutes. I actually invented dabbing in 1994. I have some cats here, 2 of them. They stay with my mom right now because we can't have pets in the apartment anymore. This is them watching a YouTube video of crows, which I often like to do, play little pranks with my cats. This is how I see them. And this is how they see me. This is my fish tank from about 2 years ago. I promise it's going somewhere. So yeah, what does any of this actually have to do with anything or with tonight's talk? So let me tell you about a story that will lead into tonight's subject matter. So when I was a young child, probably about 10 or 11 years old, my parents got me a small fish in a small fish tank. At the time, I didn't know anything about keeping fish. I wasn't a marine biologist. And sadly, my fish didn't do very well. Within a couple of weeks, it had passed away. And I was pretty saddened by this, and I didn't keep fish for several years after that, until maybe 3 years ago I decided to get back into the hobby. There's an actual photo of that fish, by the way. So yeah, remember that story, because we're going to come back to that later. This is Remy, the remembering fish, so when you see Remy, you'll remember that story. So yeah, 3 years ago I picked up from there. I decided to visit fish keeping like a professional this time. I didn't want to have living creatures that I was taking care of that were suffering for any particular reason, because I didn't know enough about maintaining water parameters, making sure the temperature was right, feeding them the right food, that sort of thing. I didn't want the creatures that I took care of to suffer. So I decided to get back into fish keeping using design thinking, etc. So I started off with a little bit of research to figure out what fish were about, how to deal with them. Ended up putting together massive spreadsheets where I had a row for every species of fish that I would keep, what their ideal water parameters are around temperature, pH, water salinity, water hardness, and any additional notes around the social life of that particular species of fish. So if that species of fish needed to be around other fish of the same species, that was taken into consideration to ensure that fish was happy. Here's another part of that spreadsheet where I actually listed out all the different products that I would use in maintaining the water conditions, the amount of those products that I would need to use in order to maintain a certain climate within the fish tank. I had a conversion slide that would let me very quickly convert any units of measurement from all the fish care products that were generally coming in from the US, so you were seeing a lot of units like gallons and ounces, and I had to do all these conversions. So I just put together a really simple spreadsheet that allowed me to do that on the fly. Here's some photos of my actual fish keeping equipment. some water testing kits, so anytime I could check the pH of the water, or any other number of measurements, some more stuff, some buckets and hoses and whatnot. So after doing this for a while, I kind of arrived at a revelation and came up with this term. So fish-centered design. So fish-centered design was a really interesting way for me to think about taking the phrase human-centered design and seeing how we can zoom out from that and think about how our work affects the wider ecology and the wider ecosystem that we share with other living organisms. It allowed me to step out of the scope of designing for humans and start to think about how designing for other beings could help me be a better designer when I design for humans as well. So I actually put together a little video a couple of years ago on YouTube called Fish-Centered Design, Part 1. There isn't actually anything useful in that video. It's just footage of my fish tank and disco music playing in the background. So you might enjoy that. It's actually still up there. Hovering at a whopping roughly 300 views. I started to think about using design thinking methodologies and techniques to just take my fish keeping hobby to the next level. So I thought about thinking of species of fish as personas and how I could start designing the habitat for those fish as if they were personas. Certain limitations you run into with research is that you can't exactly interview fish. And at some point I realized, hey, I'm not the only one that could benefit from all the research that I did into that particular area. So I decided to put together some kind of app or device that you could put inside your fish tank that would relay data in real time to the cloud and tell you, hey, you need to do a water change. Hey, it's getting a bit warm for that particular species of fish that you have in there, and so on and so forth. This isn't an actual photo of it, it's just something I found on the internet. But I took that idea, went to Shark Tank, and I asked for $400 million for 5% of my company. Mark Cuban politely asked me to leave the room. Okay, that didn't actually happen. But here's what did actually happen. Applying design thinking to fish keeping made me a more empathetic and more scientific designer. And let me talk about that a little bit more. It made me a more thoughtful and more patient human being. For anyone that's ever kept fish, you need to have patience. Everything you do has to be done at such large timescales to ensure that your fish don't experience any kind of shock, to ensure that your plants don't experience shock. So you have to be patient if you're going to keep fish. And fish keeping helped me be a more patient human being. It taught me that when we can solve problems in unrelated domains to human-centered design and UX and learn a lot about human-centered design and UX. But most importantly, it taught me things around human and animal suffering. It taught me things about humanity. And tonight's subject matter, language. So let's dive into language. Has anyone here heard of the phrase internal dialogue? I'm sure most of us have. So what is it? It's, in a sense, they're words that transform our perception of our reality. It's the conversation we have with ourselves, whether it be it positive or negative, whether it's critical or empowering. Those words affect our reality in very profound ways. Has anyone heard of affirmations? I'm sure we all have. Here are some of mine. So language is a profound phenomenon and not just a means of communication. We can think of language as a way to categorize and describe things, but more so than that, language can transform the way we experience and perceive the world. So if you look at these affirmations from before, these are just words, but they transform my reality. They transform my day-to-day experience. Words have shaped civilizations. Here's a great quote by Terence McKenna. He says, "Cultures are virtual realities made of language." I think the right combination of words spoken at the right moment, with the right tone, to the right audience, have many times changed the course of history. Here's another quote by Nelson Mandela. Without language, one cannot talk to people and understand them. One cannot share their hopes and aspirations, grasp their history, appreciate their poetry, or savor their songs. Another quote by Terence McKenna. If the world is made of language, then you can hack it in the sense that you can hack code. So we'll get back to that point in a second. But what I'm trying to say here is that every key cultural or technological epoch has given us new language to describe the world and the new paradigms that come along with that. And I'll give you some examples. So when cars first became a thing, they were called horseless carriages. When computers first became a thing, they were called electronic brains. The word megabytes entered into the common dialogue. AI introduces terms like machine learning and neural networks. UX gave us Crazy 8s and human-centered design and design thinking. What's particularly interesting about UX is that we've borrowed a lot of language from fields like marketing, physical product design, architecture, psychology, anthropology, and even physics. So if you look at atomic design is a way to describe design systems with the language of physics. So we use terms like atoms, which describe a single element in a user interface, a button. A molecule is a combination of those atoms, and you get larger and larger structures. So I was inspired by this concept and how it related to my work with fish and the world of biology, and thought about, I thought about how we could use the language of biology and ecology to talk about design in more profound and meaningful and useful ways. By the way, there's a picture of my actual fish tank right now. These are two of my favorite fish. That's Piers Morgan, that's Johnny Utah. Now my fish live in the wild. They would live in a habitat, which would be something equivalent to a swamp or a coral cluster or within a catacomb of water. That habitat is part of an ecosystem, which is a larger structure, and an ecosystem comprises of those components. And this ecosystem is part of an even larger structure, which is a biome. And a biome is kind of a super system, like an entire desert or an ocean, or the forests as a kind of geographical theme. And a biome is part of the biosphere, which is our entire planet. Here's a visual representation of what that kind of looks like. There's some other language there around grouping the creatures within those systems. So you have individuals, populations, communities, ecosystems, biomes, and the biosphere. And I thought, what if we could use that in design and around design systems? So here's an example. The word design systems. What if we could do this? What does that mean? Is that useful? Is that just playing around with words for no reason other than because we can? Well, actually, maybe it can be useful. So when we think about the word systems and what that implies and the kind of inherent weight that the word systems comes with, you think about other words like fixed, systematic, process, order, structure, organization. When you think about the word habitat, you think about other words like dynamic, living, interconnected, balance, evolution, natural selection, organisms, organization. So what does that do when we think in terms of this type of language versus language that we're currently using around design? So those two words are very similar, systems and habitats, but one makes us think different about what this structure is of a design system, and how we feel about it, and how we go about designing and doing the day-to-day work. The word habitat has different undertones and peripheral structures around it. So peripheral structures is a phrase I made up. So let me try to explain that. What I mean by that is when you use certain words, they come with the weight of the other concepts that are attached to those words. So when you think habitat, you think living organisms, for example. When you think systems, you might think a factory or a machine or technology, something like that. So when we use certain words, it's important that we think about how those words can be perceived in relation to the things attached to them. I'll give you an example of Atlassian's design system. So I went to a great talk by Alex where one of the things she brought up was that Atlassian uses analytics on their design system components. So whenever a designer uses a sketch component or a symbol or a particular pattern, they have analytics that tracks when designers are using them in their sketch files. And over time, you start to see trends on what patterns are being used. And we could parallel that to structures in nature, like natural selection, like evolution, mutation. But already we're starting to see how we can start to borrow language from biology to describe certain processes and certain structures in design and technology. Also, nature is the ultimate user testing mechanism. Think about natural selection. It basically is hardcore user testing. I'll give you another example of where we can borrow the language of biology, and this is something I'm currently working on at Fox Sports. So looking at our different companies that fall under News Corp. So you have Fox Sports over there. You might think of Fox Sports as a biome. Within the Fox Sports biome, we have different habitats, like the broadcast habitat, the traditional news habitat, our digital habitat, and location-based habitat. So if someone's out in the pub watching a game with their friends, we could consider that as a type of habitat. And thinking about how design systems can go beyond simply being components and layouts and colors and rules around how we design things, but thinking of design habitats as ways and domains in which our users can interact with our brand. And when we talk about them as habitats, we can kind of almost connect that to the fish example, where I was thinking about how do I provide the best habitat for my fish so that they're happy and healthy. How do we think about habitats that we're creating for our users in a digital sense, in a broadcast sense, in a physical retail sense? If we use the language of biology, we start to think differently rather than just saying design system or some more rigid terminology. We can start to talk about journeys between different habitats. So someone going from a TV to a traditional or TV to digital, that's kind of like a micro journey. A macro journey would be something like going from the Fox Sports biome to like the Foxtel biome, which has its own habitats, like its TV broadcast habitat, its digital. And those are all part of the News Corp biosphere, which is a much larger structure. So when we borrow the language of biology, we start to think differently about the structures. Here's a full picture of what that currently looks like. Obviously, in reality, you have other companies also attached to that with their own smaller habitats and ecosystems within that. I thought about what if we could take design processes like sprint planning and use the language of like DNA and genes to think about planning sprints. So I might need to come up near the wall, near the TV. So here you've got one stream that's discovery, another stream that's design. So discovery and design work together, moving towards a definition. So this is still a concept that's being fleshed out. But each one of these components of the DNA is a kind of activity that correlates with the activity from the other streams. So in this example, you've got discovery. So this might be a type of workshop, and this might be a type of design deliverable. And they meet at a point, and then it moves on. And as you progress through it, you start getting into parts of this process that are around development, testing, iteration. But you could think of that entire thing as a gene. And you could take that gene and see it as being part of your product, which is a kind of organism in a sense. And thinking of how that gene can mutate, how we can use other language within biology to describe aspects of our products and aspects of our organizations and our ecosystems. Here I'm just zooming into it a little bit. But see, at the end of that particular gene, you're starting to get into kind of like a showcase and a retro, and then there's a transitioning sprint that moves on to the next gene, and that might be about delivering another component to your product. But when we think of our products as being, with the language of biology, we start to see them as living, dynamic, changing organisms rather than we deliver these features. They're more like components of an organism. It also helps us to think about the small things we do or the small components as part of a larger body. We start to think about particular cycles or periods of time, seasonality, mutation, natural selection in the context of design. So this isn't a guide about how to run sprints or about how to talk about design. This is really an invitation to start a conversation. This whole talk is more of a think piece than a guide. It's more philosophical than it is technical. So I'd invite you all to engage with me in that conversation afterwards if you like to. I'm very interested by this. There's another quote by Terence McKenna. We can move no faster than the evolution of our language. And this is why I think this particular time in design and in UX and in the world is a really important time to start thinking about the language we use and how that informs the way that we design. We need better language to help us design the world of the future with intent. And before we can intelligently imagine the future, we have to first learn how to speak about the future. We need words that efficiently convey clues as to how we should design, rather than just who we're designing for, who are the users, but how are we designing for these users? How does our work affect the things attached to our users, the wider ecology, the wider planet? And we all need to contribute to this language with more intent and thoughtfulness. We need to form linguistic panoramas that inspire and empower people. We need to think more from personas to persons, from conscientiousness to consciousness, from wordsmithing to word engineering. I believe that the most effective way to change the world is through language. And this is why this is so important to me. I think words don't merely describe things. They form the glasses, microscopes, binoculars, and telescopes by which we perceive reality. So words allow us to zoom out from humans and into the wider living machine that is our planet. And at the same time, they allow us to zoom in and address the needs of individual persons, not just personas. And on that note, I'm sure we're all familiar with this particular term. I'd like my contribution to be around the discussion of language to be this letter. I don't know why that's messed up. Was it supposed to be like that? We'll pretend it was. But humane-centered design. So by just adding that single letter to the term we all know, human-centered design, we've completely changed the way we think about the way we design. We've completely changed who we're designing for. We're not just designing for humans anymore. We're not just designing using certain methodologies. It's not about who, but about how. And that how is humanely, and taking into consideration the wider things connected to us, and not just our end users. Humane-centered design also, in a sense, as a new term, forecasts that in the future we'll have bigger and bigger issues around areas of privacy, immigration, homelessness, mental health, animal welfare. And it really, in a sense, is trying to be a language set that helps us address those problems with the right words, that help us think about those problems in a different way, not just from a technique and methodology standpoint, but from a humanist standpoint. And without the right language, we can't think about these problems in a way that benefits everyone. Design empowers us to improve the world, but language empowers us to improve design. Thank you. This is my turn. And just one last thing. So this is something that I'm currently working on. Some of you might be familiar with it. So some time ago, I went about putting together a collection of UX resources on software called Notion, which is a kind of collaborative workspace. You could go to userexperience.guide and gain access to all these resources. We're talking tools, books, PDFs, workshop templates, articles, videos, podcasts, you name it, it's all up there. You could also just go to the short URL, which is just ux.gl. We launched a Slack community about 2 days ago. There's currently 400 people that have signed up for that. So check us out. Everything there is free. It's just resources for designers. Thank you.
Brilliant. Oh, sorry, that is right. You didn't get away from either. So look, I know I've got some questions, but first of all, has anyone got questions for Kieran? Because I think this conversation is immense, and like that premise is just, you know, very, very cool. Anyone with a question? Over here. Okay. Just, can you say who you are as well?
Hi guys, I'm Estelle, UX designer. What was the thing that kind of triggered you to think about all of these things and get really passionate about like developing the idea?
The UX guide or the human-centered design?
Language, yeah.
So for me, it was fish keeping. I felt bad that my fish and that fish in general suffer when they're sold by pet stores, for example, and the people buying those fish don't know how to take care of those particular species of fish. I think a lot of the time stores have an incentive to sell you a tank and sell you a fish on the same day, because what you should be doing really is setting up the tank, getting the water running, and leaving it running with certain additives in the tank that help good bacteria grow. That when the fish get added to the tank, that bacteria is beneficial to them and to dealing with fish waste. So that's not something that a pet store owner is going to explain to you. They just want to sell you a tank and a fish. And well, not the good ones will tell you. So I realized by not having that knowledge, not having that education about what I was doing around fish keeping was resulting in fish suffering. And in a wider scale, all around the world, lack of education results in not just animal suffering, but human suffering. And being able to think about how design thinking, methodologies, and human-centered design, and now humane-centered design can help us address suffering in a meaningful way with the right tool sets, in linguistically, as well as practically, as well as technologically. That for me is something that leads to profound impact in quality of life for all beings on Earth. I'm sure we can all get behind that.
Kira, I had a question for you, really, as much as that the premise that you make around, you know, a more humane approach to human-centered design. How do you apply that, or can you apply that in the real world? Are you working on a day-to-day basis? I know you sort of mentioned that example from Atlassian, and it's good to see that ecosystem there as well from Foxtel. How's that working out for you in your day-to-day?
I think there's certain levels. I think that we have to start with things that we have guidelines around and there's regulation around already. Those are things we can start doing very easily and very quickly, and there's a lot of information around them. So things like accessibility. That at one level, it should be foundational to all the work that we do. Moving on beyond, we start to address things that have impact on people's lives in the day-to-day, in a way that is currently being exploited in some ways by certain companies. So even when you see like a red notification bubble pop up on your phone, like that red is big for a reason. It's not just because red looks cool, but because it triggers a kind of like micro fight or flight response to get you to engage with that app that you're looking at. We use we have a term called dark patterns that are when we use certain designs in a way that lead to business outcomes that are not necessarily good for our users. So being mindful as designers about the work that we're doing from a technical standpoint, and beyond that from a humanist standpoint, and even beyond that to how our work affects the wider planet and wider ecology, just from having the mindset as well as having the tools is something that can help us along that journey. But then having the words to talk about it and having the language, I think that can help us a lot as well.
Cool. Anybody else? Let's jump in here. Thanks, Sam.
Thanks for the chat. I love the fish analogy. As designers, we often get criticised around the labels and the language that we use to describe the work that we do. Everything from process to delivery, essentially, has a label that each of us have copied, thought up, made up, inherited from some other piece of material that we've seen. Are you suggesting, in terms of where this thought piece could go, may well be a baseline structure for language that we can all agree on to help those systematic senses of purpose move forward?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I think foundationally we need to start there. Like, even in design, like our job titles, there's a lot of ambiguity around them. So like, even the phrase, the term UX/UI designer, and then product designer, and then UX strategist versus UX researcher. Like, we don't even know what our job titles are, but we've been in a ubiquitous kind of fully adopted way around the industry. So if we can't even agree on that, like, how are we going to talk about how we're going to solve like major world problems as designers? And I think to an extent, I can't be too mad at UX because it is a relatively young profession compared to something like architecture or medicine, which have been around for thousands of years, and they have very well established processes and languages and methodologies, and we borrowed a lot from them. So I guess now it's about how do we start to make our own place in UX and create our own language, and how is that unique to us? And does it even need to be unique to us? Like, is that even a problem we need to solve in some ways? You know, sometimes no design is the best design. So yeah, I think starting dialogue around the language is a great first step, and that's what I'd love to see.
Oh, another question here. Sorry, I was going to jump in for you. I'll talk about.
Yeah, thanks. This is very interesting. Thanks, Kirill. Underlying all this, what's your philosophy that underlies your language? So, do you have a kind of affiliation with a particular brand of philosophy or form of looking at the world and bringing this all together in language?
My philosophy is very simple. It's to reduce suffering. And I think of suffering as a very large spectrum. So as a UX designer, we're kind of dealing with the end of the spectrum that could be like inconveniences or maybe friction in certain processes. But at the other end of that spectrum, you have really deep, profound pain. And I think as a designer or even as a human being, having the underlying philosophy of reducing suffering through my work or through my relationships with others and the beings that I interact with is the most core fundamental thing on top of which everything else can be built. So that's my core philosophy.
Thank you. Anyone else? Anyone got a question, Kira? Come on.
Kira, I was just going to mention something that you said earlier, which I think is really important. And you kind of were talking about how this approach is not unlike, say, architecture. And if we think back to, say, the 1920s, the formation of Bauhaus in Germany, the whole premise there of the sort of main architect who started that whole school of design, what wrote this, was very much about trying to look at design systems, and importantly, probably the best opponent of him at the time was a French architect by the name of Le Corbusier, who also started to actually document a thing called the modular, which was almost like what you've just shown there with the gene, of a system of design that architects could take and use again and again and again, and use it as a system. But
not be constrained or, constrained by, certain look and feel. The idea really was to try and use this as a starting point, a measurement, etc., etc. So, do you have any empathy with, that sort of thought, or is that something that you've never considered?
Yeah, I think a lot of this, pretty much everything I've presented today, is more of a it's a philosophical piece. It's kind of like let's look at certain structures, whether it is design systems or like modularity, atomic design, the gene idea, design biomes, design habitats. Let's look at what language has to offer us from domains like biology, like ecology, like physics, like marketing, like physical product design, architecture. Let's look at all of that language and see where we can carve out our own language as UX designers. A language that is not just design for the sake of design, and we're just trying to sound cool with design terms, but language that informs how we design. And then use that language to form better practices that are at the same level of maturity as something that's been around for a long time, like architecture. Yeah. I think that as a profession, we are quite young in relation to these others, but we have the benefit of being able to stand on the shoulders of giants, which are those other domains, and see how we make our own place there.
I think what you're saying is that we're a kind of crossroads, if you like, of this practice, CX, UX, UI, etc., where it's evolving. And the thing about that, sort of point of reference I made for the architecture is that was evolving. It was an evolution, revolution, if you like. And I think everything that you've shown us, the carrying the fish and all that sort of thing, there's some fundamental truths there that, if you don't follow this, the fish are going to die, or they're not going to live well, or blah, 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 and you can improve their habitat. And I think the thing that jumps out for me in this presentation was the fact that as designers, if we get given the opportunity to work on a design system, as generous, we kind of really get overwhelmed by the project and sort of feel, wow, this is, a mighty big project.
Sorry, lost
We get overwhelmed by the size of the project, and therefore that might be something that deters us. But I think what you're saying is that you could start and grow your system. Is that right? Or I misread that.
Well, I think in a sense, there's the day-to-day work. There's the things that we have to do. Design systems can be overwhelming to build, and that has its own language. But beyond that, there's the humanist aspect of the work that we do. We're not we can design pretty screens built off great design systems, built off great methodologies and all the research behind that. But at the end of the day, what I'd like UX to kind of expand to is to go beyond human-centered design and into humane-centered design, and bring in the philosophy, the ethics, those considerations, especially as we start to see things like machine learning, data science come into play, where you can start to see impacts on society that might discriminate against some people. Machine learning algorithms, how do we think about those in a way that benefits people, and it's not just data being fed into a system, and there has to be some kind of human and humane oversight on these types of technologies. So I think we in order to talk about those things as designers, we need better language to talk about those things.
I think this is working. No, it's not. It's not working. Mm-hmm. I've got mic problems tonight, but I was going to say that, in the audience, is anybody working on a design system project at all? Yeah. Could you sort of talk about what you feel is? Have you learned a different approach tonight, or do you feel that you're constrained, or how does that work out for you? You might have to come up to the thing and talk. Sorry.
One more question. My name's Allard. I work on the design system at Atlassian. Alex, who you mentioned, is my manager. I think what resonates with me with the talk is with the idea of habitat. There is a sense of chaos, and that the chaos itself breeds itself, and that
I think that's not working.
And that is the evolution. That resonates with me because I think design systems live in a space where they're trying to synthesize things that are happening in the real world that they're taking from products and trying to synthesize that into a systematic form. And that is to the purpose of the product being able to move faster, being more effective and whatnot, as well as surfacing the things that survive. So like the good pattern should stay, the bad pattern should be filtered out, right? That is kind of like what you're trying to do as a design system. So in a sense, like you are the evolutionary process. I guess the part that I find tricky to marry with the analogy of it being a habitat is that a habitat it just exists, right? Like, well, if you want to make it really philosophical, like a design system like has a business purpose, right? But a habitat doesn't yet until we figure out the meaning of life. And so the business purpose of your habitat is
I agree with you. I guess in this context, the word habitat isn't necessarily to parallel what actual habitat structures are, but mainly how the language could be used to benefit us in design. So talking about larger structures to atomic design. We go beyond physics and atoms and molecules and into things like organisms, habitats, ecosystems, and larger. So that there are some attributes that are inherent to actual habitats in nature, but what can we take from that and how do we translate that through the lens of design to something that's useful for the business, but maybe linguistically useful as well, to help inform the way we design in a certain way. So we might accept certain attributes about habitats, that they are connected to other habitats, that there are things that are changing in them, that there is an element of chaos, but at the same time, there's an element of order and overlying natural selection that's in play. So we can take those attributes and see how that can help us think about design in a different way. I guess it's a gist of the talk in a sense.
I'm just going to sort of dominate the conversation now, I don't mean to, but I think really what I'm picking up from the conversation in the room is that, the great thing about your approach is that you begin to focus, you're not dismissing design, because design is very important, but you're actually leaning design more towards a more sort of humanistic, humane angle, and because of that, it seems to be more inclusive, and I think we, as practitioners, work on a myriad of work. We're not all working in projects that might lend themselves instantly to being considered, a good feel project. For instance, I did a project last year for a company in Melbourne called Urala, and they're an incredible organisation in the space of mobility and providing services with people with disabilities. And the great thing about that project is that there's a lot of learning to be done. But once you're in that learning curve and you start getting involved in ride-alongs and going to different centres and dealing with people that have to organise a whole group of people, but at the same time trying to document or be able to sort of plot someone's progress. You see a lot of play juggling, and the humane design of you really wants to step in and try and solve all their problems from a digital perspective sometimes, but also from a logistical perspective. So I think a lot of what you're saying really rings true for me. Does anyone else have that kind of experience, or am I just going to go and nodding a bit seriously? Do you want to talk about it, or are you happy with it?
I just agree with what
Okay, cool. So does anyone else working on any design systems of merit, or they feel that they kind of could approach this kind of lens through, or no?
add something. Actually, want to get your perspective on something. So when we talk about design systems, obviously we also need to communicate the same to different stakeholders within an organization. And if you look at it, an organization itself is like an habitat. There are different creatures. Blue creatures also face assembly. That's a different thing. But when we need to sort of use language, when we need to use this way of thinking, how do you think we can really connect with them and communicate with them at the same level and basically understand their objectives? Because everyone have their own ways of thinking, everyone there and their own languages. How we can include, have an inclusive vocabulary to communicate on that.
I think it depends on the context and audience. I think as UX designers, we're at the intersection of design, technology, as in the business and a few other areas. So when we are talking with stakeholders, they're going to need a different language. We're going to need to talk about their objectives rather than talk about the philosophy behind design. But maybe when we're talking with other designers, or maybe when we're thinking about design, we can start to think in more philosophical ways. I guess when we're talking with devs, we have to be a bit more technical, be a bit more precise around how we're describing design. But it comes down to the context, like where do you use the language? Like this isn't saying we need to, all our language needs to be humane-centered language. It's more saying this is a new lens by which we can look at the way we design and how we design. But we can use whatever language is appropriate for the context.
But does this bend of mind or this way of thinking really help you connect with these stakeholders, or maybe look at it, the problem from a very different lens?
I think if everyone I'd like to believe that everyone wants to see a better world in the future. I think the work that we do has to be humane as a baseline. We should not be designing things that harm other living beings. I think when you bring that into the conversation, we have to be the voice of that in those conversations as well as designers, because if UX designers aren't talking about human and humane-centered design, who is going to talk about that? So sometimes we need to talk about that. And if the language needs to be more ubiquitous and needs to be described and needs to evolve in a way that it's more accessible to wider audiences, then that's what needs to happen. But we have to start somewhere. And this is an invitation to start. Let's think about what other languages, what other ways can we use language to make design better and more inclusive.
Cool. Okay, so I think that's probably it. Any more questions? No? One last round? Okay. Look, I have to say that, Kira, this meetup is around customer experience. It's also around creativity. I think what you've kind of brought our attention today is an incredible lens to view through, and I really believe it's going to cause a lot of conversation after today. I want to give a really big round of applause to Kira. Thank you, guys.